Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. A pleasure to be with you in this live stream, asking about the question, what is freedom? In light of the question, what is knowledge? What is love? How the finitude of knowledge does not equal the infinity of love. What builds human freedom? How do we experience human freedom fully? To the fullest potential, the fullest capacity. This is what this live stream will be considering today. If you have any comments or questions, I invite you to post them in the comment section after the video is published. Trying something a little different in this live stream and future ones. So thank you so much for joining me. Always a pleasure to be with you. Taking commentary from my 2021 book, Emmanuel Levinas and Variations on God with Us, especially from chapter 4 entitled Law and Freedom. How do we understand all of these things working together? Law, freedom, love, knowledge, responsibility, in terms of finitude or limitation, and also infinity, that which is defined by no definition, because precisely it is unlimited by definition. So we want to resume this study thinking about this proposal of Emmanuel Levinas, talking about a wisdom which knows everything without experiencing it. How would this work? A wisdom, a philosophy that knows everything without experiencing it, that can learn about things without demanding a direct experience of the thing. How could this be? Obviously, what would be involved is testimony, especially between elders and the younger ones, and a fundamental trust, this Hebrew concept of emet. This emet, this trust of God, this trust of the law of God, this trust of the wisdom of the elders, the rabbis at whose feet I sit and whose dust I pray be upon me. So in Judaism, there's this concept, a real rich concept of a wisdom which knows everything without experiencing it, a kind of a philosophical style we might call rabbinic midrash, this conflict of interpretations where one is able to learn from the masters uh, who have learned in turn from their masters and from the master of all masters, Hashem, divinity. So St. Paul of Tarsus, himself raised in Judaism, and has this late convert to Christianity, late conversion to Christianity, after he was persecuting Christians fiercely, violently. He hated them. He saw to them being put to death. The St. Paul of Tarsus eventually gives his life over to Jesus. When Jesus appears to him in a very special way, and St. Paul believes. He believes because he regards Jesus to be the truth. And St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, writes, "Everything is lawful for me, but not everything is beneficial." This we could say in a real phenomenological sense. Everything is open for lived experience. But what phenomenology in itself is not able to say is this second part of the sentence: not everything is beneficial. Maybe phenomenology can say something to this effect in terms of authenticity, or at least a very implicit comparative analysis between different kinds of experience and what happens through them, after them. And so it becomes quite obvious whether something is beneficial for a person or not. But the judgment in phenomenology would be suspended and need to go to metaphysics for this to happen. In any case, St. Paul is saying within the course of lived experience, one could have the impression everything is lawful for me. I can do whatever I want. no matter what the civic laws are, the laws of God are, any laws, it doesn't matter. I actually can do what I want. I have this will, I can just do it. So, in this sense, everything is lawful for me. But St. Paul says, but I will not let myself be dominated by anything. That's a real twist in our understanding of freedom. Not only a question, is this thing I could do beneficial for me, for other people, for the common good, but also this question, in doing this thing, do I surrender to it? Do I let myself become dominated by it? Again, in the same epistle to the Corinthians, Paul writes, everything is lawful, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is lawful, but not everything builds up. No one should seek his own advantage, but that of his neighbor. Rooted in the Jewish tradition of faith, this ethical monotheism that comes with the demands, the moral exigencies of responsibility for the other. St. Paul knows this very well. And this anthropological truth in relation to divinity is corroborated through Jesus and his life, his teaching, his church. In his exhortation to the Corinthians, Paul advocates a similar freedom of responsibility as that of Levinas. Liberty and license are not to be equated. Liberty without limits is no liberty at all, since liberty without limits amounts to a finite free will claiming to be infinite. Free will is not infinite and is not always free. The will, even though tend to be comfortable calling it the free will, having free will, is actually not always free, because as St. Paul suggests, there can be things that are not beneficial for us and things that will end up dominating us, will compromise the integrity of the will, the liberty of the will. And when we understand free will in terms of license, that is exactly what will happen. We just need to point to our common lived experience to find the evidence. But free will is not infinite because each choice implies one thing rather than another. The will has this pretentiousness to think that it is omnipotent and infinite, as if it were from eternity. The human will, this seething pride, we read in 1 John in the New Testament, this pride of life, this self-assertion, the will can act as if it is infinite, as if it is divine. And this is the essence we read in the Hebrew scriptures of original sin. This pretentiousness, this arrogance that I don't need God because essentially I am divine. I am omnipotent. I am infinite. My will is an absolute. And some philosophers reason this way. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, this Willen zu Macht, this will to power, as if it's the most essential concept for philosophy. But Levinas is saying something different. A free will which pretends to exercise a limitless capacity becomes enslaved both to illusion and to some other finite good in a disordered way. To elevate a finite good or set of finite goods to the status of the infinite is dishonest and illusory. Through phenomenological analysis, it is clear that liberty turned into licentiousness leads to enslavement to one thing or the other, and eventual destruction of the self and the other. Phenomenology easily can gather up this evidence. When someone confuses liberty for licentiousness, destruction follows. Not only temperance, but self-mastery is the virtue par excellence, which anamnestically remembers the other at all times. It is the unlimited summons to responsibility for the other that pronounces the true character of the infinite. Another word for this limitless responsibility and vocation to serve the other is love. In his same epistle to the church in Corinth, St. Paul writes, "Love never fails. If knowledge, it will be brought to nothing. For we know partially and we prophesy partially, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. At present I know partially, then I shall know fully as I am fully known." So we can reflect on what St. Paul is saying here and conclude that love is infinite. Knowledge is not. How so? There are three ways to demonstrate this assertion. So let us think philosophically and take the patience to do so. So the question is, why is knowledge not infinite, but love is? The first point, knowledge is contingent on love rather than vice versa. Each act and fact of knowledge does not produce the infinite, but merely confirms the finitude and futility of knowledge. If knowledge does not serve the greater vocation to love, it is vain. So, similar to St. Paul in his later work, Levinas identifies philosophy come of age as, quote, the measure brought to the infinity of the being for the other of proximity, and is like the wisdom of love. The wisdom of love at the service of love. This he writes in his book, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. If I have knowledge of everything under the sun, but have not love, it is all to no avail. In fact, I probably will use the knowledge to destroy other people and myself. If knowledge does not serve the greater vocation to love, it is vain. Knowledge confirms various data series, but does not put the data at the service of a higher good than the data themselves. Algorithms and AI cannot love. The banality of knowledge confirms the priority of love and the anteriority of the other. In his book of God Who Comes to Mind, Levinas writes, nothing in effect is absolutely other in the being served by knowledge, wherein variety turns into monotony. This is the phenomenality of knowledge, the process of knowing, where otherness dries up, where the other is reduced to facts and figures, or even the plasticity of manifestation, where otherness starts to fade away, is this obsession with knowledge. Even we could say a Cartesian obsession for certainty. But instead, love is what steers knowledge in a meaningful and beneficial direction. Love finds meaning in knowledge because of its desire to share knowledge and rejoice in knowledge with another person. Again, in his book of God Who Comes to Mind, Levinas writes, quote, the proximity of the neighbor, rather than passing for a limitation of the I by another, or for an aspiration to the unity yet to be effected, becomes desire nourishing itself from its hungers, or to use a used word, love, more precious to the soul than the full possession of oneself by oneself, end quote. So Levinas sees the proximity of the neighbor as something very positive, so that it is the very context of ever lived experience, proximity of the other, of the neighbor. Even when I seek to know a thing, the call of the other does not take second priority to my obsession of knowing this thing or even getting this task done. But what Levinas is bringing back to mind is the call of the other, and with the call of the other comes the signification of the infinite and divinity. Apart from a communal context of knowledge sharing, knowledge gained by oneself alone is lonely and short circuits without being passed on to another. Knowledge without teaching is dead. Knowledge without traditioning of the knowledge, without handing it on, without regarding oneself to be its steward, knowledge is dead. Knowledge is alive to the degree that it is shared, just like love. And why share? Why would knowledge be shared? For the sake of love. The best teaching is motivated by love. Besides, gaining knowledge always involves another person from whom that particular knowledge comes in the first place. What do I know that I did not receive in one way or another from the other? From my parents, from my teachers, from these say rabbis and masters, to whom I am so much in debt. Even if new knowledge is discovered, the discovery was made possible by a sharing of knowledge by a plurality of persons leading up to the discovery. So, this is the first point. Knowledge is contingent on love. It depends on intersubjectivity in all cases. And if we depersonalize knowledge through a kind of flattening of it through screens, then we are betraying uh, what it actually gives, the full resonance of its givenness, which is always intersubjective, interpersonal, communal. So one could go about learning and gaining knowledge without giving credit where credit is due, and the knowledge itself will be very flat, limited, truncated, and in the end, inaccurate. The second point, how love is infinite but knowledge is not. There is a stoppage of knowledge at points of fatigue, disinterest, and incomprehension. Knowledge is not an infinite process because inquiry naturally terminates at various levels where love for learning more about a particular topic is lacking. In addition, there are points at which the mind realizes that it has gone as far as it can go and can go no farther. Rene Descartes taught us as much when he argued that the idea of the infinite comes to us from an elsewhere, since our minds themselves are finite. One idea we cannot produce, know fully, or circumscribe by the powers of our minds is the infinite. It is an idea which saturates our limited modalities of comprehension. Concerning the idea of the infinite, we know that we know it, in that we do not know it. We certainly do not produce it. Knowledge bumps up against many epistemological paradoxes, such as that of the idea of the absolute, the idea of God, and many metaphysical ideas such as actuality, substance, form, pure acts, absolute being, and the soul. Simply because we cannot fully comprehend these ideas like we can comprehend other phenomena poor in intuition, like mathematical formulas, or even adequate in intuition like the world of objects, this empirical worldview. This fact alone does not rule these other things out of the real de facto or de jure. So Jean-Luc Marion's work is very helpful in this for us to think about saturated phenomena. Even any event is not circumscribable by cognition, by thought. It saturates any ready-made concepts, modes of analysis we have, to reduce the event to some manageable data. It gives too much. It saturates thought. And if this is the case for every event, whether a football game, a concert, a musical event, an artistic event, like even interacting with a painting, a work of art, a dance form, ceramics, pottery, even the events of history, even just one. If this is the case of events that they saturate, all the more so these prized philosophical concepts, we could very well say the most valuable ones, such as the infinite, the absolute, divinity, actuality, substance, being itself. These are, by definition, incredibly saturating concepts. And we can't insist that they cease their saturation for us to be attentive to them or for us to believe in them. They give, we interpret, we respond. It is not that logical evidence is lacking or absolutely no intuition gives itself in these instances. Instead, both metaphysics and phenomenology allow us to detect realities which must be the case in light of realities we know with greater degrees of relative adequacy. We logically posit necessary conditions of possibility in terms of being and causality in metaphysics, and we perceive phenomena that give themselves in saturating ways and that attest to themselves through the indefinability of alterity through the course of intersubjective relationships in phenomenology. We never could reduce a human person, a human being, to an object without doing great violence to the person. For example, theologian and philosopher David Tracy has demonstrated sufficiently the relative adequacy of both certainty and knowledge. For example, in his book Plurality and Ambiguity, Tracy writes, quote, "For relative adequacy is just that, relative, not absolute or apodictic adequacy. If one demands certainty, one is assured of failure. We can never possess absolute certainty, but we can achieve a good that is a relatively adequate interpretation. Somehow, conversation and relatively adequate interpretation suffice. As Hilary Putnam reminds us, in some situations, enough is enough. Enough is not everything. Sometimes less is more. When there are no further relevant questions, either from the text or from myself or from the interaction that is questioning, then I find relative adequacy." End quote. So, this relative adequacy, if we are honest with ourselves, if we come clean about our vast epistemological uncertainty of all the phenomena we deal with on a daily basis, then we realize the caducity of knowledge itself, and that there's something much more assuring to us than knowledge of this or that. And if we experience something like short-term memory loss, or memory loss of any kind, what is it to know a thing? Memory is involved, but what meaning has the thing known? What purpose has the thing known? We're brought back to the question of meaning and purpose, motivation to act. And why should I act? What is the cause of my action that is most worthy of admiration and respect? Is it not love? David Tracy writes, again in his book Plurality and Ambiguity, quote, "To lose any belief in pure self-presence, as well as any claims to certainty or apodictic knowledge, is not to deny the possibility of knowledge itself. What we know with relative adequacy, and we know it is bounded by the realities of language, society, and history. On any particular issue, we can know when we have no further relevant questions. It is possible, therefore, to know when we know enough. This is really what we mean by knowing something. I know enough about it for now. But as we know, when we continue to learn, we learn how much we don't know, how much we have yet to learn. Socrates recognized this, for example. The more I know I do not know. It's a great paradox about knowledge, that the absence of knowledge dilates to the degree of the possession of it, of present knowledge. So this is the way for knowledge. There's a great chiaroscuro of light and darkness here with knowledge, and it's a great adventure. It's wonderful to continue to learn, to continue to know, but always with humility. Knowledge is not meant to be a matter of violence and possessiveness and competitiveness and meanness and hatefulness. That is no knowledge at all. That is ideology. That is impatient angst. A variety of things it could be in terms of the pathology of this way of discourse, of speaking. But what we're thinking about with Levinas is a very pacific way of philosophizing. It's peaceful, it's ironic, it's charitable, it's generous. We could even say, perhaps, rather pacifistic, this way of philosophizing, where I'm not even in a hurry with thought. I'm not doing violence to thought because I'm tempted too much to conflate it to ideology, to practical and political purposes. The philosopher refuses the near occasion of ideology in the name of the saturating whole, which ideology never could contain. Because what's meant by ideology is reductionism. A reductionism. This is why phenomenology is so helpful as a method of philosophy, because it brackets every reductionism. It reduces every reductionism and therefore expands the horizon of lived experience, of receptivity, of perception, of interpretation. This is what we're getting at with these phenomenological thinkers. So David Tracy, in these quotations I just read, points out the layers of interpretation which mediate between the objects of knowledge and the knower in every case of knowledge. There is, in fact, no fact which is self-identical to the knower, just as there is no knower self-identical to the infinite. Knowledge is infinite neither in quantity nor in any degree of quality. It is always conditioned upon the limit question and the limit situation of contingent and interpretively bound realities which surround every act of knowledge. Knowledge reaches its natural limit when questioning on a particular topic ceases. If there are no further questions of interest, and sincere questions, not just questions as bait for the one doing the answering, but sincere questions of interest, there is nothing further to know. So knowledge is led by the question. And as we're critiquing knowledge here and its pretentiousness to appear to the knower as infinite, we're also giving an appreciative reading of knowledge as necessary for thought. It is the food of philosophy, but not it alone. If there are no further questions of interest, there's nothing further to know. We know when we know enough, but knowing enough simply attests to the finite process of knowing. Our experience of knowledge is constantly conditioned by our desire, or lack thereof, to know. Again, love is what prompts us to know for the sake of acting in meaningful ways in light of knowledge gained. Love is our deepest motivation with everything. Even when one feels lacking in love and wants to war against it, it is still a very disguised way of dealing with love. Um, this is so interesting for us human beings. The person who wants to deny that love is his deepest motivation is affirming it with the very insistent and sometimes violent act of denial. And the same when it comes to belief in God. Again, love is what prompts us to know for the sake of acting in meaningful ways in light of knowledge gained. Knowledge, in other words, is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. Knowledge serves love. Paul of Tarsus sums it up well. In 1 Corinthians again, he writes, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. So this is the second way we tell the difference between the finitude of knowledge and the infinity of love. There's many points of fatigue, disinterest, incomprehension in the process of knowledge. It does not give itself in unlimited ways, even if some kinds of knowledge, especially theological knowledge, is very saturating. Uh, it's for the sake of something else, namely love and the infinity of love. The third way to distinguish the infinity of love and the finitude of knowledge, so the third way out of three here, is to describe the respective processes of each. It has been said by highly educated people, as I alluded to before, the more I learn, the more I realize I do not know. This is how knowledge works. The more knowledge gained, the more one is aware of the knowledge one lacks. In other words, the more knowledge gained, the greater lack of knowledge is realized. We read in the book of Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew scriptures, the sayings of the wise are like goads. Like fixed spikes are the collected sayings given by one shepherd. As to more than these, my son, beware. Of the making of many books there is no end, and in much study there is weariness for the flesh. Very true. The more knowledge is obtained, the less knowledge one has according to the recognition of the immense deficiency of knowledge by the one who knows. Ironically, knowledge decreases the more one knows. So interesting, such an interesting paradox. With love, on the other hand, the more one gives away, the more one has. Wow, that is stunning, I think. At least it hits me that way. The difference between knowledge and love. The more one knows, the less one has. The more one loves, the more one has of love. This great paradox, love, the more one gives away, the more one has. And the same we can then say for knowledge. Once we understand this phenomenality of love, knowledge become teaching. Knowledge become catechesis. Knowledge at the service of the other. Knowledge for the sake of the next generation that is coming after I die and as I die. Knowledge at the service of love, willing this good of the other. Love is goodness giving itself away. So knowledge, too, is not in itself bankrupt, but we have to call a thing what it is. And knowledge for the individual person certainly decreases the more one knows, in terms of um, the more I grow in knowledge, the more ignorant I realize I am. So this process of loving, this great paradox of love, to receive it, you must give it away all the more. The process of loving is the very opposite of the process of knowing. Knowledge is something to be grasped and consumed by the mind. Often we think of it this way, though we can treat it in another way according to the dictates of love. Whereas love operates according to humility and self-emptying. This is why loving disinterested knowledge is the most precise knowledge there is. Knowledge that does not involve self-interest is the most exact kind of knowledge, because if there's self-interest involved, it is manipulated, it is warped, knowledge is tinkered with for the sake of fulfilling the ideological self-interest at stake, as if the self-interest itself trumps the purity of disinterested, loving knowledge. And we learn through the Judeo-Christian tradition, this illumination of reason by divine revelation, that the greatest evidence for the most precise knowledge is self-giving love. Self-giving love itself gives us the greatest assurance that we know the real, because according to the measure of the gift, the paradigmatic is the real. At the heights of the philosophical enterprise, a surrender must take place of reason in relation to revelation, to divine revelation. And this is the most reasonable thing to do. Sooner or later, to trust the knowledge that comes from the mouth of the infinite, more than any piece of finite knowledge that already comes contaminated with the hidden passions of self-interest. So knowledge operates according to pride and self-assertion. Oftentimes in academia, we feel this. We feel the thickness of the ego of the academic. There's no knowledge, no publication that goes without its pretentiousness. And living in academia for the past 13 plus years, it's a real turnoff to truth, I think. Pretentiousness, this throwing the weight of one's ego around, gets in the way of the humility of truth. Even in Christian theology, yes, it's very sad when this happens. It's really absurd. It's really sad. But the kind of secularization of theology, of academia, for the sake of getting tenure or building one's CV, getting that job, all of these worldly motivations pollute the purity of the theological project. And this is why the best theologians typically are not the people with doctorates, but the people at the soup kitchen, the people who are marginalized, the poets, the children, mothers, people with various kinds of disabilities are the greatest theologians on the face of the earth. The ones that are definitely not popular, that not many want to listen to. This is the difference between love and knowledge for the sake of knowledge. But fortunately, we can move toward a loving knowledge that is put at the service of love. Love is the true face of the infinite, and knowledge merely mimics the infinite exchange of love through an inverse pattern of self-sufficiency and self-concern. Love is concerned with the good of the other and never ceases to be responsible for the other. Again, in his book, Of God Who Comes to Mind, Levinas writes, quote, "Love is only possible through the idea of the infinite, through the infinite placed in me, by the more that ravages and wakes up the less, turning away from teleology and destroying the time and the happiness of the end." Wow. End quote. Levinas, again, taking commentary from my 2021 book, Emmanuel Levinas and Variations on God with Us. Wow, that is very rich. So what Levinas is getting at there is when he says turning away from teleology, it's a very metaphysical concept and has its place in metaphysics, the final cause toward which a thing becomes, a being becomes toward its telos, especially living beings, biological beings, human beings included, not just biologically speaking, but also rationally, spiritually, the formation not only of the body, but also the soul. And what Levinas is saying here is that when we're talking about the infinite, there is no terminus. There is no end. There is no cessation. The goal is the perpetuation of the act of the drama we call love. Love is that which builds up eternity. Eternity is not waiting for love. It depends on it. Praise the Lord, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I praise you, God, for your revelation, that you never fail us with your unconditional love, your constancy, and in this moment now, your truth comes into view, especially from the inside. Your truth that pushes us upward, outward, and further inward. So I praise you in this moment as an interlude to continue the philosophical reflection. Why not? It's best to enter the praise and the thanksgiving in the midst of the thinking that launches it further. So, wow. This is why I just had to write the book on Levinas. It's so rich. And hopefully the book encourages you to read more Levinas directly, especially his two great works, Totality and Infinity, subtitled An Essay in Exteriority, and his other book, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. But there's a lot of, I would say, if you've never read Levinas before, to start with some of the interviews. The interview, I think the book is titled, little book, God and Ethics, something like that, or God and the Infinite. An interview, very good. And then this book by Joe Robbins, edited by Joe Robbins. The title, Is It Righteous to Be, is a great book to get in conversation with Levinas. Those are two fantastic sources. Any of the interview material with Levinas. And then also I'd recommend his book, Entre Nous, Between Others, Between Us, essays in there. Maybe reading those interviews and those essays before getting into Totality and Infinity and Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. So I'm just going to present for about 15 more minutes here. Again, if you have questions, comments for me, I invite you to make them in the comment section of the video, and then we can carry on a respectful, philosophical, coherent, intelligible conversation there in the comment section. So it may very well be that teaching, which adheres to the pedagogy of love, subordinates knowledge to the service of love. Charitable teaching puts knowledge always at the service of the other for the good of the other. If not wedded to ethical considerations and the eschatology of love, knowledge is in vain. It's very ephemeral. It doesn't go anywhere. It's kind of like money. So many good comparisons to money we have. Money, um, money and knowledge are similar in that I could save up all the money possible for myself, and I see it in my savings accounts, and I see the number grow, and then I die. And finally, the money might serve somebody that gets my inheritance. But if I, as this individual, very selfishly, self-concerned, in the name of the preservation of my being, or in the case of the worst case scenario and the what ifs, I'm just stockpiling my money and saving it, saving it, saving it. It doesn't do me or anyone else any good. First of all, I'm misunderstanding the purpose of money that's meant to be in circulation to promote the surplus of sociality, to promote these loving interactions between ourselves. When I share my money, when I give my money away, when I make the business transaction and I'm not upset because it cost more than I thought it was going to cost, when I'm content with the circulation of money, I'm understanding both money and knowledge and being according to the hermeneutics of gift and the hermeneutics of love. That just as love is a gift that is received to the degree that it is given away, so it is with things like money and knowledge. The purpose of the knowledge I have gained is not to puff myself up and not to think I know so much, but to share it through teaching, an act of serving the other in love. And the purpose of money also is to share it, to let it circulate. If I'm possessive of money, sooner or later it possesses me. And we don't want this to happen. That is a confusion of means for ends. And so money, like knowledge, is meant to be in circulation. And the way that knowledge remains in circulation is through teaching, not just turning knowledge into a commodity and making money off of it. And as St. Paul says, a worker deserves his wages. So all of us have no choice but to deal with trying to make an income to pay bills and things. But in terms of when there's excess, when there's surplus, and even when there's need, to be able to share is an act of great mercy. And it becomes the point. If I'm only thinking about myself and how this money will support my ongoing existence, I am not thinking money through love. So this would be another example: money, knowledge in relation to love. This priority of love fosters a freedom for excellence, and the priority of knowledge engenders a freedom of indifference. I've talked about these in a previous live stream. Love's aim is to act always in accord with the good. It's accountable. Love understands itself to be accountable to a higher good in relation to the individual self. The individual self makes sense only in relation to the other. If I dislocate myself from the other, I less and less understand myself. But love's aim is to act always in accord with the good. Knowledge's aim is to keep a distance from the good so as not to be swayed by anything other than the pure act of knowing and the subsequent purity of the will. For knowledge, the distinction between good and evil is arbitrary Inasmuch as the neutrality of knowledge is indifferent to moral distinctions due to its exclusive interest in raw data and facts, or even just the satisfaction of curiosity, no matter if someone, whether it be another human being or God, judge the content of the curiosity as good or evil. The phenomenality of Google, of search engines, pretends to signify neutrality. It's its phenomenality. Pretends to signify neutrality, and by virtue of its originally blank contents, strikes consciousness with an aura of digital indifference. Just as a computer is indifferent to good and evil, so is the phenomenon of a web search engine. How interesting. Wow. Okay, I'm thinking of something. I think this is a good takeaway. Um, huh. This I have to think about more. But God creates human beings in the image of God, in the imago Dei. Many scripture references talk about this. And humanity, if we don't look back to God to understand who we are in God's image, we don't know who we are. We really don't know who we are. If we let God be eclipsed in our lives, we then take the place of God by acting like we're the creators of the universe. And we have all our inventions and all our theories and all our stuff. And so then human beings create stuff. And it's like, instead of recognizing how God became incarnate in the terrain of our humanity, we make an imposture of the incarnation through a disincarnation of our humanity in our technologies that have no soul, that are not personal. Hans Urs von Balthasar talks about this effect of secularism on the soul, yes, indeed, of absolute atheism on the soul, that the soul becomes anima technica vacua, a technological, vacuous soul. And we live according to a disincarnation of our being. And we're more fascinated by our technologies than by the other person who faces me. There's digital indifference. And if we make ourselves, if we understand ourselves, no longer in the image of God, but in the image of our own inventions, we become like them. We become like algorithms, and our discourses themselves are very robotic. There's no genuine thinking. We ourselves become a tool of our own technologies, and how much life is lost in that disincarnation of the person. So much is at stake in this philosophy. Just as a computer is indifferent to good and evil, so is the phenomenon of a web search engine. You won't be shunned by the search engine, no matter what you search. In fact, the search engine encourages you, the more incognito, the better. And so go incognito on the internet. Let none of your history be remembered. As if it's true. As if the interface of the internet, it's promising me anonymity, inconspicuousness, and I actually believe it. And so I go on and I search these things and I indulge my lusts of various kinds and my curiosities. And I think it's hidden to everyone, including God. But that is not the truth. And we think it's hidden from myself. It's not the truth. So instead, there's accountability. But our experience of the search engine in extending our noetic consciousness through the neutral composition of digital technology, we take on virtual avatars of robotic and androgynous personas that soar above the distinction between good and evil in the name of knowledge. And this too, we're brought to so much confusion about our anthropology, about our sexuality, because of all of this digital, the phenomenality of the digital and digital indifference. Even more nefarious, when knowledge is blended with curiosity, there is no end to post-innocent virtual exploration. The temptation of temptation commences and sustains this virtual world which hovers above good and evil. The temptation of temptations opens onto a happy place, a happy, quote unquote, happy place where all is permissible and nothing is taboo. In her essay, Attending to Suffering in and at the Wake of Postmodernism, Jennifer Geddes writes, quote, because temptation makes nothing irreparable, it also makes nothing forbidden and everything safely permissible. Mistakes can be erased, risks taken safely, and hence nothing is really at stake, end quote. So this phenomenality of the temptation of this digital indifference is reinforced all the more by ideological strongholds, whether liberal or conservative, it doesn't make a difference, extremes meet, which too claim to be beyond good and evil. For liberal ideology, something like Google symbolizes emancipation from censorship and a beacon of the freedom of choice and autonomy. But for conservative ideology, something like Google is a hub of consumerism and the endless foray into the free marketplace of knowledge, enjoyment, and novelty, also bringing with it a radical autonomy. Extremes meet in the temptation of temptation, in the world of ideology, in the virtual world of digital indifference. So altogether, the internet poses as the panacea for every desire, yet provoking insatiable desire all the more. And if you've ever gone down that promiscuous road, whether in terms of sexuality or knowledge or consumerism or trolling, you recognize the insatiability of what's going on. No one thing satisfies that craving, but the craving is set on fire all the more with every unfulfilled search. Because it wields the power of access to innumerable virtual worlds and experiences, the internet provokes the temptation of temptation. When getting to enjoy the internet in this virtual world, this flattened cosmos, but still something to engage with, why leave any stone unturned, we might think to ourselves. If the essence of Torah, though, is to know God and to unknow all false gods, idols, the internet surely offers a plethora of distractions from knowledge of the divine, insofar as it spurs on the will to explore a legion of alternatives to the narrative of the people of Israel, the chosen people, chosen for the sake of all humanity, and their allegiance to the one true God, Hashem, the Lord. Since the internet serves as the gateway to so many roads other than that leading to the promised land, it detracts the sojourner to truth from its singular destination. Even if I search the sacred name of God, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, I will find myself searching and searching to no avail, because this God, by definition, will never be encountered in the potency of pixels or in the windows of wandering. Rather, the true and living God is to be encountered in the departure from the temptation of temptation and a movement out into the uncomfortable wilderness. To quote a book of Joseph Ratzinger entitled Spirit of the Liturgy, where he writes, quote, "What is significant is this, that ethical monotheism of Judaism was not able to develop in the great cities and fertile countryside of Mesopotamia. No, it was in the wilderness, where heaven and earth face each other in stark solitude, that monotheism was able to grow. In the homelessness of the wanderer, who does not deify places, but has constantly to put his trust in the God who wanders with him." End quote. The glowing screen must be vacated in order to encounter the living God in the stark solitude of the natural wilderness, where celestial luminaries meet grains of desert sand, is that privileged place of theophany, where God reveals God's self to us human beings. Likewise, where I encounter the human other face to face is the locale in which God comes to mind. Because the internet features a capital experience of the temptation of temptation, it must be renounced at first in order to be reinstated as an instrument of virtue and self-forgetful altruism. And phenomenology can help with this conversion of the natural attitude, this digital indifference, and reawaken what is personal and spiritual in us. Whereby the temptation of temptation aims at preserving a self-insulating notion of freedom as license, Torah reintroduces a freedom that came before license, a freedom that came before license, freedom as responsibility for the other, showcased in God's responsibility for us, that he journeys with us, he comes to liberate us. The event of the exodus of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt is this paradigmatic event, which will witness for all time to the solicitous will of God in relation to humanity, the humble, loving fatherhood of God in relation to humanity that is revealed to the extremity in the Word become flesh and the eternal Son of the Father with face and name Jesus of Nazareth. And then, inasmuch as the internet serves this purpose, freedom as responsibility for the other, its use is justified. So I hope that's what we're doing here in this live stream, promoting this freedom that is built by love and responsibility for the other, entirely personal, not impersonal, not superficial, not marked by anonymous knowledge or digital indifference, but a very personal freedom that goes by the name of love, a very personal truth that also goes by the name of love. Truth is less than itself if it has no personality, it has no selfhood. Truth reduced to facts or sense perceptions or certain kinds of empirical theories, which become entirely impersonalized, end up technologizing humanity. In this, we have to work against by renouncing the disincarnation of personhood into technology, but instead turn to the incarnation of God in humanity. Again, taking commentary from my 2021 book, Emmanuel Levinas and Variations on God with Us. Thank you so much for joining me in this live stream. And again, if you have comments, questions, I invite you to put them in the comment section of the video. I think this will allow us to carry on a much more responsible, respectful, meaningful conversation together as we think about these things. So may we all continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.